Welcome to episode 140, Authenticity Isn't Easy, Navigating Through Grief During Gender Transition, featuring Zander Keig, licensed clinical social worker. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth E. Riaz, and today I am excited to be joined by Zander Keig. Zander is a licensed clinical social worker in many states and also a specialist in the area of transgender and non-binary identity. Zander, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, Beth. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about a topic that is very complex and weighty in this conversation about addressing grief as part of gender transition. How did you develop this specialization in working with the transgender and non-binary community? Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about you?
Absolutely. So I'm a trans man myself. So as a member of the trans community and a mental health provider, it felt like a natural fit to be within the community and work with the community. I've also been a member of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. I've been a faculty member with their Global Education Institute since 2017, and I'm now a mentor for people who are seeking that certification as a gender specialist through WPATH. So it's both through teaching and through my clinical work. I did gender therapy for a while. I found myself in this really fantastic job with the U.S. Navy between July 2016 and January 2019, where I was working with the transgender care team. And so I was a clinical case manager to that team, and I worked with somewhere between 250 and 300 active duty sailors and Marines who were going through a command-approved gender transition. And so that job in and of itself, I don't know that it necessarily cemented me into the field, but it because it was a full-time, that's all I was doing job, it really did give me some credibility outside of just being a trans person, right? Because a lot of times people within, say, gender therapy world, they don't necessarily always consider trans people to be able to contribute to the field without immense subjectivity and the inability to reach objectivity. And so I feel like I can do a really good job of being both objective and subjective. And I've really enjoyed, the opportunity to be a consumer and a provider within the transgender community.
Thank you so much for your work. I mean, you are such an experienced clinician and also trainer. So today, why don't we start by talking about how this concept for this particular interview came up for you? Why this topic?
I was talking with another therapist who's also a faculty member with WPATH, Global Education Institute, and we were talking about how there are family members in particular, because they were working with some family members who were experiencing grief and loss because a member of their family, a spouse or a child in particular, is going through a gender transition, mostly medical, sometimes social gender transitions. And so I was talking to them about what do you say to somebody who is expressing that they're feeling lost because the person they knew is, quote, gone. And they sort of pushed back a little bit on that and said, well, they're not gone. They're just becoming their authentic self. And I thought, well, I mean, I know I've heard that. I've heard people use that kind of languaging. And it got me to thinking, I know that's not the language I use to talk about my experience of gender transition. And I've talked with hundreds of other trans people, primarily trans men, and we all use different language. So I thought, has anybody actually done research to look into what are the different ways that we conceptualize and frame our gender identity, our gender expression, our gender roles, our sexual orientation, the prospect of actually, quote, changing genders or becoming our authentic selves or being gender affirming, like all these different, words and phrases that people speak all the time, and not very many people actually know what they mean when they're hearing these things. And a lot of times I don't know that we actually know what we mean when we say them. And so I did find one study, just one, that was focusing on looking at the types of conceptual frameworks, social conceptual frameworks that people use to talk about their gender identity. And then I looked at this same researcher then looked at some of the ways that the frameworks in which the frameworks that people use socially, and then the conceptualizations we have of ourself. And so that's Kristen Norwood, and she did a study back in 2012, or at least published in 2012, a paper called Grieving Gender, Trans Identities, Transition, and Ambiguous Loss. And I went, oh, ambiguous loss. What's that? So then I went and looked up ambiguous loss and found that there was a book written about ambiguous loss by Dr. Pauline Boss in the 1970s. And so these two things came together. And then that's when I started talking to people about it. And really, quite honestly, I experienced a lot of pushback from trans people, from therapists who work with trans people, from family members of trans people, from people who work in trans-specific organizations focused on youth. There's a lot of pushback on recognizing and or supporting the grief and loss process for family members and also for trans people.
As you're talking about it, I'm thinking about that concept of the dialectic, that both of these truths could be valid simultaneously, that someone can be their authentic self while still experiencing grief and loss and going through this process of coming to authentically represent themselves in the world, in the community. So tell me more about this idea of ambiguous loss. What does that really mean? And how do you see this applied to this concept of grief and loss in relation to gender?
Ambiguous loss is defined as a loss that has no closure or ending. And it's broken up into two different kinds or two different parts. There's physical ambiguous loss, which can be summarized by the phrase gone without goodbye, right? So like maybe because of natural disaster or war or a plane crash, we've lost someone or something, right? Physical ambiguous loss. And then there's psychological ambiguous loss, which is goodbye without being gone, right? That phrase captured it. So for example, dementia, addiction, or gender transition, right? So for example, my father, he has dementia now, and sometimes he remembers who I am, and sometimes he thinks I'm one of his brothers. And so he'll call me Zander. Sometimes he'll call me Sven. That was my uncle's name. And so, you know, he's physically still present. I'm still physically present, but my relationship with my father is not at all what has been or what it was up to, you know, for at least 54 years of my life, right? So he's not physically gone. He's still physically present, but I have a loss that I'm experiencing because my relationship with him has changed dramatically. So when somebody's in addiction, the same thing can happen. It's like you can see the person, they're right there, but perhaps they're just incoherent. They're not capable of recognizing, you know, what they're doing or where they are. Sometimes with mental illness, right? If somebody's in a psychotic episode, they're there, but they're not the same person that you know, right? In how they are in that moment. With gender transition, with all the different conceptualizations and frameworks, right? For some people, this can feel like I can see my son or daughter. I can see my husband or wife. I can see my brother or sister, my mother or my father. They're right there. They're in the room with me. I can talk to them on the phone. I can do email exchanges with them, but they're changing right before my eyes. And so I'm experiencing a loss, they might say, because if that person's not my husband anymore, who are they? And who am I? Am I not a wife anymore? And are we in a lesbian relationship now? Do I want to be a lesbian? I mean, so we go, people go through that, it's like, that used to be my son. Now they're saying they're my daughter, and they're telling me that they never were my son. And it's like, but I know I gave birth to them. The doctor said it's a boy. So who am I if I'm not the mother to my son? I don't know how to be the mother to my daughter or vice versa, right? So that's where it's coming in, this idea of ambiguous loss when it's relating specifically to the psychological ambiguous loss, and in particular, the gender transition component of that.
Why do you think it's difficult for not just clinicians, but for people in general to hold this concept Why does it feel like it's in opposition to the concept of authentic self?
Well, I think it breaks down when you start looking at the two different social conceptual frameworks that were identified by Ms. Norwood in her research. You have the biological essentialism framework, right? So the biology influences precede cultural influences. So we have a sex, right? We have a chromosomal sex, a natal sex, a biological sex, a sex assigned at birth, right? There's a lot of different ways to phrase that. We have a birth certificate, and the word male or female in most states, in some states they're changing that now, is recorded on that document, right? So biological essentialism, we're men and we're women, and some of us, or we're male and female, I should say, and some of us are intersex or have a differentiation of sex condition where it's instead of XX or XY, it's XXX or XXY or YYX. There's a lot of different combinations. And then there's the social constructionism conceptual framework, right? That culture influences precede biological influences. So it doesn't matter. Like in my case, it doesn't matter if I had a social constructionist worldview. It wouldn't matter to me that my sex recorded on my birth certificate and the reproductive capacity that I was born with is categorized as female, because I live in the world as a man now. And so I can completely deny or reject or dismiss entirely this concept of biological sex. And I can just live in the world as a man, as a trans man, a transgender man, a transsexual man, right? There's many different ways to talk about it. Whereas there are going to be some people who are going to say, no, even trans people who say, no, biological sex exists, whether you call it biological or natal or chromosomal, right? These things are within biology, the science of biology. And so, for example, I could say, I live in the world as a man, my sex is female. I can say that. I actually do say that. I don't have a problem saying that. Now, do I say it to my neighbor? No. Do I tell everybody I work with? No. But I tell my doctor. I want my doctor to know what my birth sex or natal sex is, because it might determine which medications they prescribe to me, the dosage of that medication, the delivery method, the interval in which I take those medications. So I do want them to know that, but it's not necessarily something that everybody needs to know about. So when you think about just the different way that people conceptualize, there's a lot of tension between biological essentialism and social constructionism. There is a way to overlap it a little bit, but most people find themselves in one or two of these groupings.
And you're saying that because of these groupings and kind of the steadfast adherence to one or the other, that's where it crashes into this idea of grief and loss, depending on how you're conceptualizing gender.
Well, so you go from the conceptual frameworks of biological essentialism or social constructionism, and then into a conceptualization of self. Right. And so based on the research, there were two conceptualizations of self identified: sovereign and social. So the sovereign self identity is inborn and independent of the body. So people who have a sovereign self conceptualization might talk about things like a soul or a mind, right? That their personhood exists within them in this physical way, the body way. And then a social self conceptualization, identity is malleable, right? Material and observable, meaning my body, how I appear to other people socially by the clothes I wear, the way I style my hair, whether I put on or not put on, makeup on my face. The intonations I take with my voice, right? So the sovereign self, the beyond the body, or internal to the body, versus social self, which is the external, what we show to the world, what is observable by others. So it's like those frameworks, those social frameworks, and then these conceptualizations of self. When you look at those four things, right, the two frameworks and the two conceptualizations, it turns out that there's four different sense-making frames that can come out of that because of how you link the two from one to the two with the other. So in the research, it goes into some great detail about these four different transition sense-making frames labeled as replacement, revision, evolution, and removal. And so based on the interlocking between, well, what's the difference between having a biological essentialist and a social self-conceptualization? How does that manifest? Versus somebody who has biological essentialism as their conceptual framework, but self-sovereign conception of self. The next is evolution. That's if you take that's for people who take a social constructionist, worldview, meaning man, woman, not male, female, right? Social constructionism. And then you merge that into somebody who has either a social or sovereign self. And then the last one is removal, which is it's unanchored by either frameworks or concepts. It's individuals who completely create new meanings for themselves. That was the fourth sense-making frame that was identified from the participants in the research. So I found that really interesting, and I see that that's a fairly common thing, especially nowadays, right? This research was done in 2000 or published in 2012. But if you think about 2021, there's a plethora of identity labels that people have now. There's a lot of this self-sense making, but I would imagine that some of it is still influenced by social conceptual frameworks and also by conceptualizations of the self. It's just that we don't talk in this kind of language. You'll probably hear people more often than not that are trans say, I don't really know how to describe who I am and how I feel and how I came to understand this about myself. It's quite complex and convoluted, honestly. I don't necessarily feel comfortable in explaining or describing it most often. It did help to find this research because at least it gives me an idea of how one person was able to make sense out of the research that they gathered. But it's not like I've committed to memory and I can just say, oh yeah, I have this framework and this conceptualization, because I don't tend to talk that way, and I don't, it's very academic. So I'm still trying to make my own sense out of it without completely crafting my own, meaning making. I haven't done that either. I'm just not sure where I am in all of this different sense making.
For you, as someone who works predominantly with people who are either in transition or are working through gender, how do you talk about this? Because what you just said is so heady and academic. How do you frame that in terms of psychoeducation to make space to talk about this complexity in the therapy room?
Well, part of what I do is I listen to the languaging, right? I listen to the words that clients use, because it's pretty common for people to use language that suits them, at least for the time being, and we can cue into that, right? We can pay attention to how are they describing their experience? What kinds of words are they using, right? So if we think about the biological essentialism being about our sex, and we think of social constructionism being about our gender, well, how are our clients talking? Are they using language that's more foundational to a biological essentialism? Are they talking about, right, their sex versus their gender, right? Are they transsexual or transgender? That could be, in and of itself, that's a controversial question to even ask. Using the term transsexual can be often very controversial. I use it because that's the word I use to talk about myself, but it's not a word that people, I wouldn't recommend that anybody just start calling people they think are transsexual, because it's typically not going to be true. But typically people who are transsexual are using more of a biological essentialism frame, right? To say, yeah, the doctor said male, and I grew up, socialized as male, and I I may have had some incongruency, but there's going to be a variety of levels of that. Some people have really severe incongruency, and some people have fairly mild incongruency with their sex and their gender. And so I listen to how people talk about their gender, and what terms they're using. And of course, some people use a lot of terms interchangeably as if they're synonymous. And they're not technically synonymous, so we have to kind of listen under or through that a little bit. Because, for example, people might say, "Oh, I'm a trans female," but they take a very social constructionist viewpoint, so they're more gender focused than sex focused. But they'll refer to themselves as trans female. It's like, well, maybe it's trans woman, because female is the biological category. Or we're running into an issue where people completely either disregard or are intent on dismantling or deconstructing, or some of the words you might hear, even the notion of biological sex. Which is why now there's movements in Britain, in particular in the United States, of feminine groups of feminists who are pushing back on, there are definitely females and we are those, right? So there's some pushback on this from outside of the community. It's quite an interesting thing to start talking about, but also to experience. So I listen to what people say, and then I ask them questions that have to do with everyday kinds of ways that we might be expressing our gender. We might be experiencing our gender. So I'll pay attention to maybe how they're dressing, and I'll notate it. And I did that for one client in particular that I recall, where for the first 7 or 8 times we met together, this is somebody who was, their original birth ticket said male. They're identifying as a transgender woman. They had not yet started any social or medical transition, no legal process at all. And they were showing up to therapy sessions in really disheveled in their clothing, right? They weren't grooming. Their hair was all messed up. They were in raggedy sweatpants and a raggedy kind of overstretched t-shirt and flip-flops. And then all of a sudden, one day they show up to session and they're wearing a really tight, multicolored, dress from the 70s. Think of, like a go-go dancer dress, go-go boots, and a parasol, and makeup, and a new haircut. I mean, literally, I saw them 1 week before, completely disheveled. They made a significant switch in how they were presenting. And it's because they had gone to the clinic and gotten their hormones. And so they had started hormones and thought, okay, now I'm going to do it, and changed everything about themselves just like that. So it was really interesting to see that, to observe it play out that way. And the things they started talking about, the topics changed, the way they sat changed. Everything changed. It was so fascinating. I hadn't had that experience before. And so it was new for me. So I was really paying attention to it. And, I would ask them questions that had to do with what were the things they were doing just throughout their day that they considered gendered, right? Because they would make comments like, I want to do more feminine things now. And I would say, well, what are feminine things, right? I would just get them talking about those, because then that helped me understand how they were making sense of their world. And largely what I noticed was that there is a lot of, because it's so complex, even the way people talk about their own experience can be kind of complex, and it can almost seem to conflict, I guess. People can take both. They can hold biological perspectives and social constructionist. And this does exist. There's, people actually, there's a field of study where it's combined together. But generally speaking, it's not as common. So then having to sort out, are they just confused? Are they more set in biological essentialism than they are in social constructionism? Or are they really okay? Are they comfortable with these things, melding together a little bit? So it's just getting into the nitty gritty of how people talk about their experience, and then also things that have to do with how do they want to be different in the world, right? It's when I was maybe a year on testosterone, it was pretty clear to me that people saw me differently. They were treating me very differently. So that led me to believe, well, that means I can be different. I can actually change my own self if I wanted, not just my outward self, not how I looked and sounded. I could actually I could take up a new hobby. I could join a different kind of social club. I could get involved in activities that I had never either been interested in, or maybe I was interested, but I saw that it as being not something I wanted to do because maybe it was too feminine, or it was right. There are all kinds of ways in which we get to reinvent ourselves. And there might even be some trial and error with that, sort of like in adolescence with teenagers, they go through trial and error with what they wear and thinking that they might like boys or girls and, it's actually both. And, there's more than just boys and girls. And right, the shifts and turns and twists that come with adolescence. We get to do that as adults, which is both exciting and, can be somewhat painful, socially and psychologically.
For our listeners, John Sovek had joined me and we had this conversation about the continual coming out process. And so I want to point you to that as another resource. Zander and I are having this conversation about identity and how we exist in the world and how we make sense of it. When recognizing clinically that a client you believe is experiencing ambiguous loss, how do you talk to them about that idea? I know it's something in my work that I see frequently. I see it with family members as well. And this idea that we had whatever concept growing up or, in having this child and one day they'll be married and to a nice man and, whatever that was. And all of these ideas that there's this concept of loss. But for you, how do you talk about that with clients and with families? How is it different? How is it the same depending on who you're talking to?
Well, this is where Christian Norwood's research has come in handy for me, because when we look at the 4 different transition sense-making frames, there's a way to look at how the person is framing and framing their life and their personhood and conceptualizing how they are out in the world. And when you relate it to gender transition, there's a way in which how to frame then the ambiguous loss, that frame, right? There's even going to be a different frame. So for example, when we look at replacement, right, which is one of the transition sense-making frames, when we look at replacement again is anchored by biological essentialism and social self-concept, right? So for example, what a trans person might say is, I'm a different person now, right? They're replacing who they were with who they are, right? I'm a different person now. So the sex is viewed as natural, binary, fundamental component of their personhood because they take this biological essentialist viewpoint. I'm a different person. I've transitioned from female to male, or male to female is another thing you might hear someone say, right? Male and female are considered fundamentally different categories of personhood from being a man or a woman, right? In this replacement frame. So for ambiguous loss, it's looking at grieving the loss of the self, the self that's being replaced. So that's where the loss would go. So somebody, the idea of a parent might say, I had a blue-haired, blue-eyed daughter and now I have a blonde-haired, blue-eyed son. Right. So they're trying to frame their world in this replacement mode from this to this. And so the ambiguous loss is, well, that person that they quote lost, right? The person that's being replaced. A lot of people, you'll hear trans people say, I'd psyched myself up for the transition, thinking I was just going to be like a personality change. I would grow a beard, or I would grow breasts, whatever, direction people are going in. But then all of a sudden they didn't expect that they would feel grief at the fact that they were losing their relationship as father to their child, or husband to their wife, or mother to their child, or wife to their husband, or wife to their partner, right? If they were in a lesbian relationship. So, right. So it's that's the loss they're experiencing, because I'm not that anymore. I'm now this. And so if you go into the revision, that sense-making frame for gender transition, it's still biological essentialism, but now it's in the sovereign self, right? And so you might hear people say things like, they're the same person on the inside, or I'm the same person on the inside, right? So sex is viewed as an internal component of personhood. Their anatomy, their chromosomes, their hormones, they don't identify or they don't indicate, whether someone is a man or a woman. And you'll hear people say that, like that's a fairly common thing, or people might say, I've always been a man or male, or I've always been female. And so with the ambiguous loss, the focus there is that maybe what's happening is somebody is partially avoiding grieving the loss of that self, right? Because they've made a revision. Instead of a replacement, they've just revised. I'm still the same person I've always been. Even though they may start to look and sound very differently, that to them is inconsequential, right? And so there might be a focus on making sure that there's not some sort of grief, that maybe it's not, make sure that it's just not being avoided, instead of just accepting, on the surface, like, okay, you're still the same person inside. But then when you go to the evolution sense-making frame for gender transition, now this is social constructionism, and then it's sort of a hybrid of social and sovereign self. And so what you might hear people say are, I'm progressively changing into my authentic self, or they're now their authentic self. You might also hear people say things like, I'm both the same and different, right? This is getting to your point about what if it's both, right? I'm both the same and different. So with I'm progressively changing into my authentic self, or I'm becoming my authentic self, right? The before self leads into and is part of the after self. So it's not a replacement and it's not a revision. It's just a natural evolution that they're going through, right? That's how they're making sense of it. In the I'm both the same and different, right? The male and female are divergent yet compatible, right? They can identify or occupy both identities, just not at the same time. So you might hear people who are maybe non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, where they kind of feel a sense of like, well, I'm kind of male some days and I'm female other days, or I feel more like a man or more like a woman. They might even change the way they dress. For them, it's more of an evolution. And so loss is a little bit neutralized for people that may have this gender transition frame, because in some ways they're gaining something that's new, because they're evolving. There's something different about them that's new and exciting, that doesn't cause the same sort of maybe internalized sense of incongruence or dysphoria, or the external, right? So you might hear somebody say, I had a son, now I have a daughter. I have the memories of my son, and I'll build new memories of my daughter going forward. Lacey was my daughter, Kyle is my son. Like, they're speaking about the same person. Lacey was my daughter and Kyle is my son. So they're talking about the same child. So that's kind of the evolution. So it's like ambiguous loss, like how to talk about the loss people might be experiencing. It can depend on these frameworks. And then the final is removal, which is, it's unanchored, of course. Remember, by either of the frameworks, essentialist, the biological or the social constructionist, or by either social or self or sovereign conceptualizations of self, right? So you're going to hear people say things like sex and gender are irrelevant to personhood, right? They just completely remove the notions of sex and or gender from their identity entirely. So you might hear people there like otherkins, or they take on new terminology that people don't yet know. So they're not easily sort of pocketed into something that people go, oh, I know what that means. Or they'll say, I'm neither male or female, right? People say that. You hear people say it all the time. They're creating a non-sexed gendered self. Right. So some people create a new identity, a new gender. Some people just reject gender and sex altogether. Right. So the ambiguous loss focus would be, for some people, this also would then help them to somewhat avoid, or it might even alleviate, a sense of grief and loss, because if you can just sort of reject it all, you might not feel the need. There's nothing to grieve. That doesn't mean that there won't be grief, but in this framework, it's harder to see that process. So because you might say to yourself, well, how do I reconcile losing my dad but keeping my dad at the same time, right? It's even more ambiguous in some sense, but the loss doesn't seem to be as tangible, right? Or I used to think I had a daughter who became my son, but now sex has become irrelevant to my perception of Jackson, right? It's just Jackson now. It's not the son or daughter. It's not even the child, right? It's like Jackson. It's this person. So it's still complex. And it takes time to really feel comfortable, thinking in this way, talking about it. I mean, maybe even people can hear me as we're talking. Like it doesn't just roll off the tongue. That's for sure. It is still fairly heady and academic. But when we get down to these phrasings, right? I'm neither male or female. I'm both the same and different. I've always been fill in the blank. Or I transitioned from blank to blank, right? These are phrasings that we've heard our clients say, if we've done any significant work in the trans community. So when we think about just the phrasing, then that will help us recall what the sense-making framework is and what the ambiguous loss focus can be.
Within the community, tell me about these different sense-making frameworks and how they either complement or kind of crash into each other about the quote-unquote right way to view oneself.
Well, there are going to be a lot of collisions because we all make sense of our world very differently, right? Just within the human population, there are many, many, many worldviews. And so, there are people that we share a worldview with. And so we tend to cluster together with people who share our worldview. But we are aware that there are people who have other worldviews. Well, it's going to be no different within the trans community, right? Which is made up of many, many, many different identity groups. And so we're going to have people that make very different sense of the world. They have different moral foundations. They have different core values. And so we bring, right, that part of ourself, we bring into our, it's part of ourself as a trans person. So we're bringing this whole complex person, ourself into the trans community. And so we're going to encounter other trans people who are adamantly opposed to how we make sense of the world and how we make sense of our own body and our experience. We're going to meet therapists who have a worldview and a conceptualization that's very, very different. And if we don't get to a place where more of us can be open to and hold that there's many, many different ways to make sense of the world, to make sense of our being, and to make sense of our identity and those expressions of that identity. Without that, I think we're going to have people who are going to be either misdirected. They're going to lose direction. I think there are going to be people who are going to experience more gender dysphoria than maybe they need to because they don't know that there's so many different ways that they can frame and conceptualize themselves because they've been given, a packaged deal. Here's how you should conceptualize yourself and here's how you should frame your experience. And that's it, right? That's the only way to do it because that's the dominant narrative, in the trans Twitter universe. And it's like, that's just not the truth, right? So I think it takes a certain amount of self-efficacy. We really need to be able to know exactly what we need and want, and we need to advocate for ourselves. We need to be able to set boundaries. We need to be able to, right? These are things we have to either learn or we need to cultivate. We need to go seek people who can help us, hone those skills, or else we're going to be like a pinball in a pinball machine, just getting whacked around by people who are directing us into how to be the right kind of trans person. And that's not going to work for a large number of people. A large number of people in the trans community are going to be grieving what I would phrase as gendered meanings, right? They're going to be experiencing a loss of gendered expectations and a loss of gendered relationships and a loss of gendered identities, right? These are things that we live these things. Now, is this going to be as true for a 14-year-old who's going through a social transition as a 54-year-old who's a relationship is ending and they're starting a medical transition? Absolutely not. necessarily, right? So we have to hold in mind the context of the person, the place, and the time. But in general, right, if we're married, there's a particular set of expectations, whether we buy into them or not, whether we adhere to the social norms associated with marriage or not, they're external to us as well. And we may be married to somebody who holds more traditional views of things than we do about gender. And so they're going to be impacted whether we aren't, and whether we want them to be or not, right? So it's also just thinking about the truism of lived experience, right? And that's all the rage now, is getting things from the lived experience. Well, I value the lived experience of people who share very, very divergent worldviews for me. And I value the lived experience of people who challenge me and want me to speak differently. I'm not going to probably, but I do value, right, that lived experience of the family member who's grieving and the family member who's not grieving. I think that they're all valid experiences of their circumstances and situation.
As you talk about that, it harkens back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation, that idea of balancing the objective and the subjective. Because for a cis person to be working with somebody who's trans or non-binary or in transition, to be considering this, of course, we have our own framework, but not the lived experience of that, versus someone who has lived experience and may or may not have ever gone the heady academic route to really define it and say, option 2, that's me. That's how I explain this thing that I'm going through, with a sprinkling of option 4. And then to sit in the room with somebody who is option 3 and have that potential dissonance and discord in the way that they present and how they make sense of it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've heard from countless trans people who have had that experience in sessions with clinicians. And I think people mean well. These are not conversion therapists, by the way. These are people who market themselves as gender affirming therapists. These are people who have been through trainings to be gender affirming therapists. They may even have friends who are trans, which is kind of a funny thing to think of saying, because you can't really use that for other affinity groups. So I have friends who are blah, blah, blah. But sometimes it works, and people use that phrasing. And so what I find is that, again, I think they're well intentioned. What I think is that what happens too often is that people are very limited in their exposure to multiple trans people who frame their identities and their experience in multiple ways. And so, for example, I had an encounter with a therapist just a couple of months ago who has a family member that is non-binary and is really, really active in asserting, the family member is very active in asserting that being non-binary is somehow superior to being binary, right? They kind of use languaging that makes it sound like somebody like me who is, quote, binary trans man, that somehow my lived experience is either less valid or it's actually problematic because somehow I'm reinforcing some really terrible thing they might call like hegemonic masculinity or something like that, right? So again, all academic terms, but that's how people, so this therapist was heavily influenced by that family member. And so now they're working with some clients, and some of them are non-binary, some of them are gender fluid, gender non-conforming, but that doesn't mean that they all have the same views as this family member. It doesn't mean that they all take the same, have the same concepts of themselves as a non-binary person. They might be using the same terminology, but they might live it out very, very differently. But I could tell from my conversation with this therapist that they didn't really think, or they didn't realize that there might be, if you met 100 non-binary people, you might hear like close to 100 different ways that they conceptualize and frame their identity, even though they're all using the same word. And so I just, I do it fairly diplomatically and casually and gently. by just maybe telling some stories, oh, well, I was working with a non-binary client a few years back and this is what they said. And I might, just sort of interject in that way because I don't subscribe to a call out culture. I'm not going to call out a therapist. I'm just going to maybe give them some other examples to see if they can expand their worldview, right? Their paradigm of how they're viewing gender. Because I don't think that they're malicious. I don't think they're have ill intent. I just think that they have very limited exposure and they're going out into the world and saying, I'm a gender therapist. And maybe it's too soon for them to really hang out that, that sign. Maybe they need a little bit more exposure, a little bit more training to understand just how diverse our community is, or else they might lose those clients because they don't like how they're being talked to, or they might get a more vulnerable client that is susceptible to being directed if they're taking a more directive, intervention model. And so they might easily be, directed, and it turns out it might be a misdirection for them, and they're only going to find out about it later. Meaning the client, right? The patient's going to realize, oh, that really wasn't the right thing for me. But maybe they're not even working with that therapist anymore. So the therapist might not even know that it wasn't working for that client at the time.
There's so many levels of this. I mean, this is a conversation that you and I could keep going for a while because of the depth of even just this concept of how we in the room as therapists with our own belief systems, with our own values, with our own meaning making, how we sit with that in the room and either project that all over our clients or be aware of that almost natural projection and try to swallow it back up and approach it with what I call anthropological eyes. So with a curiosity of not assumptions about how things should be, but with awareness of how they are for that person's worldview and their lived experience, and kind of checking our belief systems at the door. But I'm glad you bring up that piece and that conflict, even within the clinical community, of how these frameworks can create conflict in how we define ourselves and then how we expect others to define themselves as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and it takes a lot of time, right? Sorting out all of this sense making while going through a social and or medical transition or considering one. There's a lot of factors because maybe we're going to school, maybe we're working, right? Maybe we're in relationship. It's like we're dealing with so many different things. And now we've got this other thing that we're dealing with. And so just being able to, have self-compassion, right? Compassion for the self and for the clinician to also maybe, practice some self-compassion for, not needing to get it right with each client and maybe actually, misstepping from time to time, and just, just having compassion for the fact that we're human and we're imperfect. And that's just part of life. And there are ways to deal with the grief. I just wanted to give a few more phrasings because I think it helps people to understand, maybe from statements that they've heard, what I mean by some of this, the grieving that's going on. So for example, you might hear clients, whether they're trans or family members, say, I love him as my son, but not as my daughter. Right. So this is somebody who's struggling with somebody who's doing some sort of transition from male to female. Right. I definitely feel that I lost my daughter and I haven't quite worked that through. Right. They feel they've lost they're not dead. Right. Although it's interesting about this idea of the idea that we don't die, right? That's why it's ambiguous also. We don't die, but some people use a term called dead name, and then they get angry at their parents for referring to them by the name that was given to them by these parents. So they're like, I'm still me, I'm just becoming more authentic. Quit using my dead name. So it's almost like a mixed message. Well, are you or aren't you dead? Right? I think that might confuse some people. Because we're mixing, metaphors maybe. The loss of your imagined future for your child completely gets turned on its head, right? Like like you said, I had this whole future planned out for my son or my daughter, right? My grandchildren. some people might say, I'm grieving the shell of a dream that has vanished, right? That's another, right? That's a bit more, something out of literature almost, right? The grief came not from losing a daughter, but from losing my identity as my daughter's father. This is a phrase that I took from the research, right? So this father is saying, I'm not grieving that I lost a daughter. I'm grieving that I'm no longer the father to a daughter. Because there is a message out there in the world, Daddy's Little Princess and father-daughter dances, right? Like, so this guy had a really strong connection with being the father of a daughter. I don't know if he has sons. Maybe he doesn't know how to be a father to a son. How are you a father to a son who is now well past the age of, tossing the ball in the front yard, to use something really conventional. My ideal life included having a husband, a man who took the lead. Now it's 50-50. I've lost my ideal notion of a marriage, right? So here's a wife, right? Married to a husband, right? A woman married to a man, and she wanted that conventional sense of a marriage, and she had it, right? Her husband did take the lead. Now her husband is going through a gender transition and doesn't want to take the lead anymore, doesn't want to fulfill the gendered expectations of a husband, of a man in a relationship. And so now this wife, right, this woman is completely destabilized in her own sense of self and her marriage. Right. So these are things that we might hear people talk about. Right. This is the non-academic heady stuff. So if we're listening, right, we can just be listening for how people are talking about their experience. And then maybe we can go back and say, okay, it sounds like they take more of an essentialist than a social constructionist, frame or worldview of them, so we can do that. And then we can mirror that back, not using academic language.
In terms of recognizing that statement that indicates ambiguous loss, I know there are lots of different perspectives on this, but I'm curious, through your lens in the work and the research that you've done, what kind of quote unquote resolution do you see in relation to ambiguous loss? What does that mean? And this launches into its own conversation about what is loss, how do we resolve it, and what does resolution mean. But I'm curious for you, when you're working with someone, what are the phrases that let you know, okay, this person is working through this, or maybe has worked through this for now, if we're looking at coming out as an ongoing process? What does resolved ambiguous loss look like?
Yeah, that is a whole big topic. What I can say is, because I'm not an expert in this subject of ambiguous loss by any means, I've dipped my toe into how it relates specifically to gender transition. I'm hoping to get a lot more knowledgeable on the topic, that's for sure, because it is quite complex. I think, when we were looking back at some of the frameworks for how people were making sense of their gender transition, right? The replacement, revision, evolution, and removal sense-making frames. There were a couple in particular, evolution and removal, that for some people, that's just where they start. And in those two sense-making frames, there seems to be, at least based on the research, there seems to be a much milder experience of loss. It's not so central to personhood, because they're making sense of their world and their experience by saying, I'm both the same and different, or I'm neither male or female. And so those actually seem to be two of the sense-making frames that come with the lower levels of this grief, right? It's the ones where people are a bit more, very beholden to either biological essentialism or social constructionism, but mostly biological essentialism, where they're going from one thing to another, or they're stating, I've always been, right? My external is finally matching my internal, is another way you might hear it say. So individuals like that, it's like, I think what would be helpful is to not necessarily move them out of those frameworks into another framework, but to help them within their framework, maybe come to a different understanding of the sense of themselves in relationship to the world and other people. It might be that they're feeling a lot of pushback. So think about if your patient or client is the, quote, husband of that wife who's like, I had this expectation of a 50-50 or a non-50-50 relationship. My husband was going to take the lead, and now I've got this other person and they're saying they're my wife and they want to do 50-50. So just think about you're working with that client, and in that relationship with their wife or spouse, I'm not sure how they would even talk about it, that might be exacerbating a lot of their sense making because they have this strong pushback. So one of the things we can do is maybe find a way to interject a completely different but not challenging the wife necessarily, just giving another option to the client, to the patient, there's a lot of different ways that you and other people, look at this situation, and maybe just try to do some expansion meaning making with people, to let them know that the experience they're having with this one family member or with their family, maybe in its entirety, is not necessarily the experience you're going to have with your coworkers at your job or your classmates at school or your peers, in your social organizations. Otherwise it might almost I think it could stunt somebody into, they might not even go through transition. Some people stop transition because they think they're only going to encounter these negative things. A lot of people, I think, can stop transition because going through grief is uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable in the body. It's uncomfortable, in the mind. It's uncomfortable emotionally. We're not necessarily sure how to talk about it. And so sometimes people will just sort of put the brakes on and back up because they don't want to go through that. So I think it's just setting the stage to let people know, like, what are the feelings of grief that you have? Just introduce it, because they might not know that it's acceptable for them to have it, because there's a strong message out there that, well, there's nothing to grieve. There's nothing to grieve because supposedly the more societally dominant sense-making frame for gender transition, the two are either I've transitioned from this to this, or I've always been this or this. Those are the two dominant ones. And so, if you're a person who believes that you're transitioning from male to female and you're encountering a transgender social circle where everybody else believes that they've always been female, they were never male, well, that's going to be a really interesting social space to be in. And so they might expect, oh, well, that's how my therapist is going to think of things too. And that's how my peers are going to think about it. They might not know that there's all these different frameworks. So it's just inviting people to talk honestly about how they're feeling and introducing them to the possibility that there's some loss and they might be experiencing some grief.
I think everything you just said is so helpful in clarifying the importance of making space for that and giving a word to it by saying grief, so that if it's something that the client connects with, they have the opportunity to go into that proverbial room, because you're saying this room exists for some people. What's it like for you? Instead of just waiting for a client to bring it up.
Another aspect of grief and loss that can come up for somebody is when they're grieving, one of these gendered meanings of things, right? Like, let's say it's a particular kind of identity, like I'm the big sister, right? And so they might be grieving the fact that they're not the big sister anymore. They might be grieving the fact that they've lost their big sister. And so one of the things that we can do as therapists is we can attempt to disrupt some of the aspects of gender identity and gender behavior that are taken for granted. It's like, well, what do you love? What do you love about your big sister? Oh, I love this, that, and the other thing. Well, maybe your big brother is going to do those things too, right? Like maybe an older sibling, maybe that's just an older sibling way of being in the world. Maybe it's not a big sister or big brother, right? Maybe we can reframe for people. Like you might hear people say, oh, I stopped going to that hobby group of mine where we were, building little planes and flying them, because it was all men, and I just didn't think it was the right place for me. And I mean, women don't do that. You can be like, says who? Who says women don't build model planes and fly them in the sky with those little hand controllers, right? Like, do what you want to do, like be however you want to be. So sometimes the grief and loss that we associate with our gender transition is because we feel beholden to men don't do this or women don't do that, or men can't do this or women can't do that. And so people who take I'm a neither or they're all stupid, they don't run into those. It's more the people who have gone from one thing to the other. That's more likely to happen, or people who are like, I've always been, they're going to be able to integrate more, their hobbies or their activities. They're not as gendered.
So Zander, you and I have talked about a lot in this last hour. With the few moments we have left, where do we go from here clinically with this kind of perspective and increase in awareness about these different experiences, different frameworks, and then the concept of grief and loss?
Well, I can definitely recommend, I'm a big reader, so I'm going to recommend some reading material. So I would definitely recommend that people read Ambiguous Loss by Dr. Pauline Boss, Boss. I definitely recommend that people read Transgender Emergence from Arlene Istar-Lev and LCSW. And so this is talking about the developmental stages, but within the context of trans people and trans identification and emergence. So Transgender Emergence is another book I would recommend. And then I would also recommend that people go online and locate the Kristen Norwood essay that was published in 2012, Grieving Gender, Trans Identities, Transition, and Ambiguous Loss. It's in a journal called Communication Monographs, but it's available for people who have access to those different portals, either through an academic library or one of those places where academics converge online and they have access to each other's papers. So that's definitely a place to look into that. Because there's so much information. Like in order to deal with and talk about ambiguous loss, it's good for us to get a very, very good understanding of what it is. And I say, why not go back to the source? Who wrote the book on it? Who basically, quote, discovered ambiguous loss? So a lot of reading would be my recommendation, because that's my go-to. And then additional trainings just in things that have to do with trans people, mental health specific. So for I mentioned earlier, I am a faculty member with the WPATH Global Education Initiative or Institute. They're changing their name, but it's not the only one. There's a new certification program out of Texas called the Queer and Trans Affirming Professional Certification Program. The first cohort is going through right now. I'm also on faculty with them. There's lots of trainings that people can do online that don't cost anything, right? That people can get more and more training. Go to conferences that have either a very large or almost exclusively transgender focus, in particular healthcare, which will have the behavioral health component too. So just expose yourself, right? Expose yourself to a wide diversity of trans people and trans thought and trans conceptualization and worldview. That will help. And we can never stop with that. Like I can't even stop, because it's forever changing. Our community is very dynamic, very fluid. That means the terms you learned yesterday are going to be outdated tomorrow in some contexts, right? So we have to constantly be evolving with this ever evolving community.
Wonderful. Zander, thank you so much for spending this time with us. For our listeners who want to learn more about you or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
I'd say the best way would be through LinkedIn. It's the only social media that I have. So if people go to LinkedIn and just type in Zander Keig, Keig, into the that little search box at the top left. I also have a website, so people can go and look at some of the things that I've done over the years. It's zanderkeig.net.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zander. You've given all of us, I think, a lot to think about and also to work on in conceptualizing these, not only for ourselves, but for our clients and how we show up in the room and make space.
Well, and my hope is that these ideas of the conceptualizations and the frameworks, right, that they're also fluid, that they're dynamic, that people are going to maybe think of new ones. They're going to expand on the ones that have already been conceptualized, right? People will do more research, right? It's like, this is from 2012. Like, what does the world look like now? It's very different. So it would be great if somebody repeated, right, maybe, and did a larger cohort of participants. Like, let's find out, do these still stand true to this day? And what else? What else haven't we learned, and what can we know?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zander.
You're welcome. Thank you, Beth.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.